My sister secretly recorded a conversation with our parents and sent it to me with a taunt. "Guess who has a surprise for you?" I pressed play and froze. Parents were laughing. "She really thinks we love her? What we love is her money." I replied with one line. "So do I." Their surprise ended. Mine had just begun. I have to ask you, have you ever realized you were the wallet in your relationship? Not the family member? Drop a comment with your city and time right now. I want to see who's awake and ready to hear the truth. To understand why I didn't scream. Why I didn't throw my phone off that balcony. You have to understand the architecture of my life. On paper, I was the lead architect for one of the most prestigious firms in Atlanta. I designed glass-walled penthouses and sprawling estates for tech moguls. My signature was on the blueprints of buildings that defined the skyline. But every night, I drove past those towers and went home to a 400-square-foot studio apartment above a bakery that smelled like burnt flour. I didn't live there because I was humble. I lived there because I was bleeding cash. Specifically, $645,000 over 7 years. That is the cost of admission to my family. It started small. A mortgage payment here. A car lease there. My father, Thomas, liked to play the part of the Southern gentleman investor. But he was terrible with money. He bought status he couldn't afford, and leveraged assets he didn't own. My mother, Lisa, was worse. To her, appearance was oxygen. If she couldn't host the charity gala, she might as well stop breathing. And then there was Savannah, my sister, the golden child who was too creative for a 9-to-5 and too sensitive for a budget. I became the structural support beam for a house that was rotting from the inside out. I paid off Thomas's quiet gambling debts. I funded Lisa's wardrobe for the season. I bankrolled Savannah's 3 failed attempts at launching a lifestyle brand. I convinced myself I was being a good daughter. I told myself I was keeping the family legacy alive. But while I was writing checks, they were writing a narrative. I found out later what they said about me at the country club dinners I paid for. Lisa would sigh, swirling her Chardonnay, and lower her voice to a sympathetic whisper. She'd tell her friends that I was fragile, that the pressure of my job had cracked me. She'd say, "We handle Wynn's finances because she just gets so overwhelmed. She's brilliant with buildings, but unstable with life. We're just trying to protect her." End quote. They weren't protecting me. They were isolating me. They painted me as a liability they were graciously managing. When in reality, I was the only asset they had. They destroyed my reputation to ensure no one would believe me if I ever tried to cut them off. It was a masterclass in demolition. People ask me why I stayed. Why a smart woman with a calculator in her pocket would let herself be drained for nearly a decade. In my line of work, we see this all the time with bad projects. It is called the sunk cost fallacy. You pour concrete into a foundation, and then you find out the soil is unstable. Logic says you walk away. You cut your losses. But emotion says you have already spent $500,000. You have already invested years. If you just pour a little more concrete, if you just reinforce it one more time, maybe it will hold. I treated my parents' love like a bad building project. I kept pouring money into the foundation, terrified that, if I stopped, I would have to admit that the whole structure had been condemned from the start. I wasn't paying for their bills. I was paying for the hope that one day, if the check was big enough, they would finally look at me the way they looked at Savannah. I thought I was investing in a home. I didn't realize I was just paying rent in a prison they built for me. 2 weeks before the gala, the load-bearing wall finally gave way. I was standing on a job site in Midtown, wearing a hard hat and reviewing the specs for a glass atrium, when my phone vibrated against my hip. It was a fraud alert from my business line of credit. I expected a double charge for lumber or a mistake from a vendor. Instead, I saw a pending transaction for $52,000 made out to Creator Spaces Atlanta. I stared at the screen until the numbers blurred. $52,000. That was not a mistake. That was a down payment. I pulled up the digital image of the check on my banking app. The signature at the bottom read, Winter Sterling. But the loop on the E was too wide. It was not my handwriting. It was my mother's. I didn't call the police. Not yet. I drove straight to the estate. The sprawling historic mansion that I had been paying the mortgage on for the last 8 months. I found Lisa in the sunroom, arranging white hydrangeas for the upcoming party. She looked up when I walked in, her face composing itself into a mask of pleasant surprise, as if she hadn't just committed a felony against her own daughter. I held up my phone. I asked her what it was. She didn't flinch. She didn't even stop trimming the stems. She told me it was an investment. She said Savannah had finally found the perfect location for her content studio, a space to film her lifestyle brand, and they needed to move fast to secure the lease. She said I should be proud to help my sister finally launch her career. I felt the air leave the room. I told her she forged my signature. I told her she stole $52,000 from my firm. Money I needed for payroll. Money I needed to operate. I told her this was theft. Lisa set down her shears and looked at me with a terrifying calmness. She told me I was being dramatic. She said I owed them. She listed the private schools, the piano lessons, the roof over my head for 18 years. She framed her crime as my obligation. She said the money was family capital, and since I was the one earning it, it was my duty to distribute it to the ones who needed it to shine. When I told her I was going to the bank to report it as fraud, the mask dropped completely. She walked over to me, smelling of expensive perfume and rot. She told me that if I canceled that check, she would make a few phone calls. She reminded me of the rumors she had already planted. She said she would call the partners at my firm and tell them I was having a mental breakdown. She would tell them I was manic, or paranoid, and financially reckless. She would say she was worried about my stability and that perhaps I needed to be removed from my projects for my own safety. It wasn't just a threat. It was leverage. She was holding my career hostage to fund my sister's vanity project. She smiled, patted my cheek, and told me to go back to work. She said we would celebrate my contribution at the gala. I walked out of that house, and for the first time, I didn't feel the crushing weight of guilt. I felt the cold, hard clarity of a demolition expert surveying a condemned building. I knew exactly where to place the charges. I didn't drive home to cry into a pillow. I didn't call my friends to vent about how unfair it was. I went straight to my office, turned on the lights, and sat at my drafting table. In architecture, when a building is compromised, you don't paint over the cracks. You initiate the demolition protocol. You strip it down to the studs to see exactly how much rot is hiding behind the drywall. I pulled out my phone and dialed the fraud department at my bank. My voice didn't shake. I was clinical. I reported the unauthorized transaction. I flagged the signature as a forgery. I froze every joint account I had ever foolishly left open with my parents. When the operator asked if I wanted to press charges against the individual who wrote the check, I didn't hesitate. I said yes. I wasn't a daughter anymore. I was a creditor. But stopping the bleeding wasn't enough. I needed to see the damage. I called Nathan. He was an old friend from university, a forensic accountant who spent his days hunting down hidden assets for high-stakes divorce cases. I told him I needed a full structural audit of the Sterling family finances. I gave him access to everything: the transfers, the loans, the shared liabilities. We met 2 days later in a glass-walled conference room. Nathan didn't look like a friend that day. He looked like a coroner. He spread a series of spreadsheets across the table, his face grim. He told me to sit down. He walked me through the numbers. It was worse than I thought. It wasn't just the $600,000 I knew about. It was credit cards opened in my name when I was in college, It was loans taken out against my future inheritance, an inheritance that didn't exist. But the real kill shot wasn't the theft. It was the insolvency. Nathan turned his laptop around to show me a document from the county clerk's office. It was a notice of default. My parents hadn't paid the mortgage on the legacy mansion in 8 months. They were drowning. The gala. The clothes. The cars. It was all smoke. They were weeks away from a bank foreclosure. They were throwing a lavish retirement party in a house they effectively didn't own anymore. I stared at the document. The legacy mansion was their identity. It was the symbol of their status. The stage for their performance of wealth. And it was crumbling. They had been using my money not to save it, but to delay the inevitable. Burning cash on appearances while the roof was caving in. Nathan asked me what I wanted to do. He said we could file police reports, sue for damages, try to claw back some of the cash. He said I could walk away and let the bank take the house. It would be clean. It would be over. I looked at the foreclosure date. It was set for 3 days after the gala. They were planning to have their big night, bask in the adoration of their peers, and then let the bank take the keys quietly while they spun some story about downsizing for retirement. They wanted the glory without the consequence. I told Nathan I didn't want to sue. I didn't want to walk away. I looked at the outstanding balance on the mortgage note. It was a large number. But I had liquidity. I had the capital I had been saving for my own firm. I told Nathan to call the bank. I told him I didn't want to pay off their debt. I wanted to buy it. The bank didn't care who paid the debt. As long as they got their money. They were happy to offload a distressed asset to a solvent buyer. It took 3 days to set up the LLC. I named it Keystone Holdings, a little inside joke for myself. A keystone is the central stone at the summit of an arch, locking the whole thing together. Without it, the arch collapses. I was about to become the keystone of my family's entire existence. I wired the funds on a Tuesday. By Wednesday afternoon, I held the deed. I held the mortgage note. I was no longer the daughter they exploited. I was the lender they defaulted on. Technically, I could have evicted them immediately. I could have sent the sheriff to their door that afternoon. I could have posted the notice on the front gate and watched them scramble. But that felt too small. Too quiet. My parents thrived on public perception. They lived for the audience. If I evicted them in private, they would spin it. They would tell everyone I stole the house. They would tell their friends that their ungrateful, unstable daughter had manipulated the legal system to throw her elderly parents onto the street. They would play the victim. And people would believe them because they had spent years planting the seeds of my instability. No. I needed witnesses. I needed the very people they were trying to impress to see the truth. The gala was the perfect stage. It was their retirement party. Their legacy celebration. They had invited everyone who mattered in Atlanta society. They had hired a string quartet. They had ordered imported champagne. They were planning to stand in the center of that ballroom and be worshipped for a success they hadn't earned. In a house they didn't own. I decided to let them build the tower. I would let them lay every brick of their ego. I would let them climb to the very top, where the air was thin and the view was perfect. And then, when they were waving to the crowd, basking in the applause, I would pull the pin. The days leading up to the party were a blur of cold preparation. I ignored the texts from Savannah asking if I had fixed the money issue. I ignored the voicemails from Lisa, alternating between sweet concern and veiled threats about my job. I focused on the logistics. I hired a private security firm, not bouncers, but professionals in suits who looked like they belonged at a gala. I gave them specific instructions. I prepared the digital files. I synced my tablet to the AV system layout I had designed for the house years ago. I knew every wire in that place. I knew exactly how to hijack the feed. The night of the gala, I dressed in a suit as sharp as a scalpel. I didn't wear the soft pastels my mother always tried to force on me. I wore black. Structured. Architectural. Severe. I looked in the mirror, and I didn't see a victim. I saw a CEO. I saw someone who was about to close the biggest deal of her life. I drove to the mansion, the gravel crunching under my tires like bones. The valet took my keys. I walked up the steps of the house I had paid for. The house I now owned. And I felt a strange sense of calm. The fear was gone. The guilt was gone. There was only the schematics. I knew the load limits. I knew the breaking points. And I was ready to bring it all down. The gala was a masterpiece of illusion. Lisa had outdone herself. The ballroom was draped in cream, silk, and gold accents. Waiters circulated with trays of oysters and champagne. The air smelled of expensive perfume and old money. My parents stood at the entrance, beaming, accepting congratulations for a lifetime of hard work and success. Savannah was flitting around in a designer gown paid for with my stolen money, filming content for her followers. Acting the part of the heiress. I walked in, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. People whispered. They stared. I could see the rumors Lisa had planted taking root in their eyes. There's the unstable daughter. The one who works too hard. The fragile one. I didn't shrink away. I walked through the crowd with my head high, nodding politely to people I had known since childhood. People who had no idea their admiration was built on my bank account. When Lisa saw me, her smile faltered for a fraction of a second before reassembling itself. She rushed over, gripping my arm with a strength that belied her delicate frame. She hissed in my ear, demanding to know why I was there, warning me not to make a scene. I simply smiled and told her I wouldn't miss it for the world. I told her I had a surprise. She looked relieved, thinking I had finally caved, that I was going to announce the funding for Savannah's studio. She patted my arm and told me she knew I would do the right thing. The speeches began at 8. Thomas went first, waxing poetic about legacy and the importance of family. He talked about building something that lasts, about passing the torch. He didn't mention that the torch was currently burning down the house. Then, Lisa took the microphone. She was radiant. She spoke about sacrifice and vision. And then, she pivoted to her children. She called Savannah up to the stage. She introduced her as the creative soul of the family, the one who would carry their name into the future of digital media. She praised Savannah's entrepreneurial spirit, completely ignoring the fact that her spirit was funded by embezzlement. Then, she turned to me. She didn't call me up. She pointed to me in the crowd and gave a sad, indulgent smile. She thanked me for my hard work behind the scenes, painting me as the diligent, plodding worker bee who supported the queen. She publicly pitied me, framing my exhaustion as a lack of spark, a lack of vision. It was the perfect narrative, the brilliant, beautiful younger sister and the dull, reliable, older one. The crowd applauded, eating it up. It was the story they wanted to believe. That was my cue. I walked toward the stage. Lisa looked confused but stepped aside, assuming I was coming to offer my own tribute, my own submission. I took the microphone. The room went quiet. I plugged my tablet into the podium's AV port, the large projection screen behind us, which had been cycling through photos of my parents' achievements, flickered and went black. I have a presentation too, I said. My voice didn't shake. We've heard a lot about legacy tonight, about building, about the future. But in my line of work, before you can build, you have to survey the land. You have to look at the numbers. You have to know what lies beneath the surface. I tapped the screen. The first slide appeared. It wasn't a photo. It was a spreadsheet. A massive, high-resolution image of the Sterling family ledger. The numbers were large enough for the people in the back row to read. $645,000 in unauthorized transfers. $230,000 in paid-off gambling debts. $78,000 in tuition for a degree Savannah never finished. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Lisa gasped, reaching for the microphone. But I stepped away. This is the cost of the legacy you're celebrating tonight. I continued. This is the foundation this family is built on. My money. My work. My sacrifice. I swiped to the next slide. The forged check for $52,000. The signature was blown up. Side by side with my real signature. The difference was obvious. This, I said, pointing to the screen, is a felony. Forgery. Theft. To fund a content studio for the creative soul of the family. The room was silent now. The kind of silence that feels heavy. Like the air before a tornado. Savannah was sobbing. Mascara running down her face. Thomas was frozen. Lisa looked like she was watching a ghost. And just so we're clear on how this family really feels about its financier, I said, I have one last thing to share. I hit play on the audio file. My sister's voice filled the ballroom. Clear and mocking. Guess who has a surprise for you? Then my parents. Laughing. Their voices amplified by the expensive sound system they hadn't paid for. Win? She's just the contractor. We let her pay for the bricks so Savannah can live in the castle. The recording played to the end. The laughter echoed in the stunned ballroom. I looked out at the crowd. I saw shock. I saw disgust. I saw the realization dawning on every face in the room that the sterling legacy was a fraud. I looked at my parents. They were stripped bare. Their image, their most precious possession, was gone. You called me the contractor, I said to them, my voice echoing in the dead silence. You were right. And the contractor is done building your lies. For a moment, the ballroom was a vacuum. The air had been sucked out by the truth, leaving everyone gasping. Then, the implosion happened. It wasn't a slow crumble, it was a violent collapse. Lisa didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She lunged. She shrieked. A sound that stripped away every ounce of her carefully cultivated elegance. She pointed a shaking finger at the exit and screamed that I was insane. That I was ruining their night. That I needed to leave immediately. She tried to rally the crowd, looking around for allies. But people were backing away. They were looking at her like she was radioactive. Thomas tried a different tactic. He puffed up his chest, trying to inflate himself back into the role of the patriarch. He bellowed for security. He shouted that I was trespassing. That I had no right to be on his property. That he would have me arrested for hacking their system. I watched them with a clinical detachment. It was fascinating. Really. They were still trying to play the roles of the lords of the manor, completely unaware that the castle had already been sold out from under them. I signaled the security team leader near the back door. He didn't move toward me. He moved toward the stage, crossing his arms and waiting for my command. My parents noticed the shift. They saw the guards looking at me. Not them. Confusion flickered across Thomas's face. You're right about one thing, I said into the microphone. Someone is trespassing. I tapped the tablet one last time. The spreadsheet on the screen vanished, replaced by a single, high-resolution document. A property deed, dated 3 days ago, stamped by the county clerk. This house, I said, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling, was in default for 8 months. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings 30 days ago. But they didn't put it on the market. They sold the distressed debt note to a private investment firm called Keystone Holdings. I looked at Lisa. Does that name sound familiar? Keystone. The stone that holds the arch together. Without it, the structure falls. I pulled the hard copy of the deed from my jacket pocket and held it up. I am Keystone Holdings. I bought the note on Tuesday. I own the walls you're standing in. I own the floor you're standing on. And since you just publicly claimed I'm nothing more than a contractor you hired, I've decided to condemn the building. The color didn't just drain from their faces. It vanished. Thomas gripped the edge of a table to keep from falling. Lisa looked around the room, her eyes wide and terrified, realizing that everyone, the judge, the mayor, the country club board members, was watching her turn into a tenant facing eviction. And that is when I saw it. The thing nobody talks about when they discuss the wealthy. There is a psychological phenomenon I call the illusion of power of the empty wallet. We assume that powerful people have an intrinsic gravity, a force of personality that commands respect. But watching my parents in that moment, I realized their power was entirely rented. It was a costume. Their confidence, their arrogance, their social standing, it was all inextricably tied to their financial leverage. The second I cut the supply, the second I revealed they were insolvent, the mask didn't just slip, it disintegrated. They didn't have character to fall back on. They didn't have dignity. Without my money propping them up. They were just too scared. Empty people in expensive clothes they couldn't afford. They shrank before my eyes. They became small. It was pathetic. I checked my watch. The event is over. I announced. My security team will escort all guests to the valet. Lisa. Thomas. Savannah, you have 30 minutes to collect your personal effects and vacate the premises. Anything left after that will be moved to storage at your expense. You can't do this. Savannah wailed. Her phone finally lowered. The live stream cut. Where are we supposed to go? I don't know. I said. But I'm sure with all that entrepreneurial spirit, you'll figure it out. I didn't wait for a response. I unplugged my tablet, stepped off the stage, and walked straight through the center of the room. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. I didn't look back at the chaos I left behind. I didn't look back at the screaming or the crying. I walked out the front doors, down the steps, and into the cool night air. The structure was demolished. The dust was settling. And for the first time in my life, I could breathe. 1 year later, I was standing in front of a new construction site. It wasn't a glass tower. It wasn't a vanity project. It was a block of affordable housing units, designed with dignity and light in mind. My firm, Foundation Architecture, had won the bid on merit, not connections. My parents? They had vanished from high society faster than a ghost in the morning. Once the fraud was exposed, the lawsuits started. They lost their credit, their friends, and their standing. They were living in a small 2-bedroom apartment near the airport now. Lisa worked reception at a dental office. Thomas was consulting, which mostly meant complaining about how the world had betrayed him. Savannah's influencer career imploded when the internet found out her lifestyle was funded by theft. She had moved in with them. And from what I heard, the three of them spent their days blaming each other for their downfall. They were still trapped in the same toxic cycle. But now, they were trapped in a much smaller box. I visited the Legacy Mansion one last time before I sold it. It was empty. The furniture was gone. The art was gone. It was just a shell. I walked through the ballroom where I had ended their charade. I stood on the spot where I had taken back my life. I realized then that for years, I had been trying to build a home inside a war zone. I had been trying to design happiness on a foundation of abuse. It was never going to stand. Sometimes, you can't renovate. Sometimes, you have to tear it down to the ground. I walked out to the balcony and looked at the skyline. I saw the buildings I had designed, glittering in the sun. But for the first time, they didn't define me. I defined them. I used to build castles for people who locked me in the dungeon. Now, I build homes for myself. And the view? It's magnificent. Have you ever had to evict your own family to find peace? Share your story in the comments. And if you're ready to build something new, subscribe.